She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just sat there, perfectly still, beside the suitcase. The cold that morning had a particular kind of weight to it, the kind that presses down on everything and makes the world go quiet. Snow had fallen overnight, not heavy, just enough to dust the edges of things, the window ledges, the rusted railings, the empty benches along the back of Hargrove Pier. The harbor was gray and still. It was barely past 9. No footsteps in the snow except mine. And then I saw her. A German Shepherd puppy, 5 months old at most. Her coat was black and tan, but winter had dulled it. Matted and dirty, the kind of dirty that doesn't happen in a day. One of her back legs sat at an angle that made my stomach drop. She was tied to a bench with a red leash, sitting perfectly upright in the snow beside a small pink suitcase covered in faded unicorn stickers, the kind a little girl might have packed with her whole heart. The note was taped to the leash. The ink had bled from the cold, damp air. "She's broken. I can't fix her. You try." I stood there and read it twice. No barking, no whimpering, no tail movement, just 2 enormous, glassy eyes fixed on the far end of the alley, unblinking, watching for someone who clearly wasn't there anymore. I crouched down slowly, snow crunching under my boots. "Hey!" I whispered. "Hey, you." Nothing. Not a twitch. Not a breath that changed. I looked around. The pier was empty in every direction. Just frozen air and the distant sound of water moving beneath the ice and this ghost of a puppy who had already made peace with being left behind. I opened the suitcase. A child's t-shirt with glitter around the collar. Plastic dog brush, still in its packaging. A juice box with the straw tucked carefully in, like whoever packed it wanted to make sure she wouldn't go thirsty. Someone had loved her, or tried to, but that was before. I called the shelter, told them I was coming in with a young shepherd pup, and then I lifted her. She didn't pull away, didn't press into me either. She simply allowed herself to be picked up, limp and weightless in a way that had nothing to do with her size. Her eyes never left the alley. Not once. Not even as I carried her to my truck and the bench disappeared behind us. I kept the heater running and spoke to her the whole drive. "You're not broken," I told her. "You're just waiting. There's a difference." At the shelter, the intake team met us at the door. I handed them the note, the suitcase. They read it and looked at each other in that way people do when they don't want to say out loud what everyone is already thinking. She stood motionless through the examination. No microchip, mild malnutrition, bruising on her hind leg. Not new, but healing badly, as though no one had thought to help it along. Through all of it, she kept turning her head toward the small frosted window above the intake table, as if some sound from outside might still mean something. When I filled out her intake form, my hands weren't entirely steady. Name? I wrote Nova. Felt right. Something about her. Quiet, distant, unreachable. Reminded me of a star burning at the edge of the sky. Before I left, I paused at the door and looked back. She was standing in the center of the kennel, staring clean through the glass panel toward the corridor and the exit beyond. Not at me. Not at the staff moving around her. Toward the direction of the alley she'd come from. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look lost. She looked faithful. I've seen a great many things working rescue. I've seen fear and confusion and the kind of shut-down emptiness that breaks you if you let it. But what I saw in Nova that morning wasn't any of those things. It was grief, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't collapse or scream. It just sits very still and waits, because waiting is the only thing left that feels like hope. I wanted to tell her that whoever had left her wasn't coming back. But I couldn't say the words, because standing there in that cold corridor, some stubborn part of me wasn't entirely certain either. The second day, she still hadn't eaten. Nova lay curled in the far back corner of her kennel, head resting on her front paws, eyes open and perfectly still. Wide open. Watching. I stood at the kennel door with a bowl of warm chicken and rice, the soft food we use for pups with fragile stomachs, and for a long moment I just watched her watch the wall. Or maybe the window. Or maybe something none of us could see. Claire, one of our senior techs, came to stand beside me and kept her voice low. "She's dissociating. Dogs can do it when the world becomes too much." They go somewhere else in their heads and just wait it out. I understood what she meant. But even so, Nova's presence filled that kennel like static electricity. Silent, dense, impossible to ignore. I opened the door and sat down cross-legged on the floor, setting the bowl beside my knee. "I know you're not ready," I said. "I'm not going anywhere either way." She didn't look at me, but the ear on my side twitched. Once. A small thing. But small things were everything right now. I took the contents of the suitcase out again and laid them on my knee. The glitter shirt, the brush, the juice box. Everything in that case had the feeling of a child's bedroom, carefully chosen, tenderly packed, and then abandoned completely. Just like her. Later, I stepped outside into the cold for a few minutes, ostensibly to clear my head. It didn't work. I stood in the car park with my breath clouding in front of me and the same question running circuits in my mind. Who ties a puppy to a bench in the middle of winter and leaves a suitcase like it's some kind of apology? Nova hadn't made a single sound since I'd found her. Not at intake. Not at the vet check. Not even when the shepherd mixed 2 kennels down spent 20 minutes barking at shadows. Total silence, but it wasn't the cowering, trembling kind. It was the silence that comes after. After the waiting becomes too long. After hope starts to cost too much. When I came back in, she was in the exact same position. But when I sat down again and opened the kennel door, she didn't draw back. She simply let me be there. An hour passed that way. I read through some paperwork, replied to a couple of messages, said nothing. And then something shifted. She moved. Not much. Just her nose. A slow, deliberate turn toward the bowl sitting beside my leg. I went completely still. She leaned forward, sniffed once, carefully, and then pulled back. But she had moved. I looked at her and kept my voice steady. "You're not invisible, Nova. I see you. And I'm staying right here." That night, just before we locked up, I stood at her kennel door one last time. She was still curled in the corner, but something had changed. She wasn't watching the window anymore. She was watching me. Not trust. Not yet. But recognition, the first fragile thread of it, thin as winter light through glass. Maybe she wanted it to be something more. Maybe somewhere underneath all that silence, so did I. By the 3rd morning, she had moved her bedding. It wasn't dramatic. Just a crumpled blanket dragged roughly 2 feet closer to the kennel door. But those 2 feet meant the world, because she wasn't pressing herself into the furthest corner anymore. She was edging, slowly, tentatively, back toward the living. When I walked in with the warm rice and chicken, her eyes came up and found mine before I'd even reached the door. Still careful, still guarded. But they found me. "Morning, Nova," I said quietly. "Cold out there today." She blinked once. I knelt and slid the bowl inside. And this time, she didn't wait for me to step away. She rose, stiff, slow, her injured leg trembling slightly under her weight, and she limped toward the food. She sniffed it. Then she began to eat. Mechanical at first, almost reluctant, like she was doing it on principle rather than hunger. But she was eating. Claire walked past, glanced in, and stopped dead. "She's eating with you still in there?" I nodded. "First time." Claire pressed her lips together and looked away quickly, blinking. You'd think after years of this work, moments like this would lose their weight. They never do. Later, while I was working my way down the kennel row, I heard something behind me. I turned. Nova was standing at the door of her kennel. Not in the corner. Not behind her blanket. At the door, watching me work, ears slightly forward. I walked over slowly. "Keeping an eye on me, are you?" She didn't retreat. I reached out, palm open, and held it still. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she stretched her neck forward, just barely, just enough, and let her nose graze the tips of my fingers. The contact lasted half a second, but it went through me like electricity. I spent my lunch break sitting on the floor beside her kennel, not talking, not coaxing, just being there. At some point she lay down facing me, and then, slowly, as though releasing something she had been holding for a very long time, she exhaled. A long, shuddering breath, deep and ragged and real. It was the first sound she had made. Not a bark, not a whine. Just breath. Just relief. That evening I opened the suitcase one more time. I took the glitter shirt and placed it at the front of her kennel, next to her blanket. I wasn't entirely sure why. It felt like building a bridge, something familiar from before, placed at the edge of what came next. In the morning it was exactly where I'd put it, but Nova had curled herself around it in the night, her paw draped over the fabric like she was keeping it from disappearing. I stood in the doorway long after the last light was out, watching her sleep. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was remembering. And somewhere inside that remembering, I think she was beginning to hope. The fourth morning arrived with frost on every window and a sky the color of old pewter. I found her sitting upright when I came through the door. Not curled. Not tucked away. Sitting, with her ears tilted slightly forward, watching the corridor, watching for me. Her gaze tracked me all the way from the entrance to her kennel door. "Good morning, Nova. Sleep all right?" When I placed the bowl down and stepped inside, she walked toward me. Limping, deliberate, careful, but she walked. And then, for the first time, her tail moved. Just once. A single slow, uncertain sway. To anyone else it might have looked like almost nothing. To me, standing in that small kennel on a gray winter morning, it was enormous. A German Shepherd puppy is not built for invisibility. They are made to connect, to press into the world with all of themselves, to protect and belong and be known. For the first time, Nova looked like she remembered that about herself. I unclipped her leash from the hook. "Want to go outside?" She didn't flinch from the leash. That alone felt like a milestone. It was our first walk together. We didn't go far, just the narrow yard behind the shelter building. A strip of dead winter grass dusted with frost, enclosed by a low wooden fence. I sat on the bench while she moved slowly around the perimeter, nose low, steps uneven, discovering the space at her own pace. She sniffed a frozen leaf, a fence post, a patch of ground where some other dog had been. And then she looked up at me, ears forward, and took 2 deliberate steps closer. I patted the bench beside me. "You can come up here if you want." She didn't, not quite yet, but she sat directly in front of me, close enough that I could have touched her without reaching far, and she looked at me in a way that asked nothing and offered everything. In that moment, with the winter sky low and still above us, she wasn't the dog from the bench anymore. She wasn't the note or the suitcase or the silence. She was just a puppy sitting in the cold, choosing to be near someone. And she was mine, even if only in spirit, even if only for now. Back inside, she walked into her kennel without being led. That afternoon, I opened her file and wrote, "Behavioral note, day 4, sustained eye contact, voluntary tail movement, responded to name, accepted leash without hesitation, walked outside, chose proximity." Then I added one line that wasn't standard form language. "She is choosing to come back to us." That night, after lights out, I made one last pass down the kennel row. Outside her door, I stopped and whispered, "Good night, Nova." She rested her chin on her paws and her tail tapped the floor. Twice. By the 5th day, the visitors started to notice her. The staff had been watching Nova the way you watch a candle that almost went out. Carefully, quietly, afraid that too much attention might tip something back the wrong way. But the weekend brought in families, couples, a few individuals walking the kennel row with that particular expression of people looking for something they couldn't quite name. Nova wasn't what most of them were looking for. She wasn't spinning in her kennel or pressing her face against the bars or performing for anyone. She sat with her ears forward and her eyes steady, calm in a way that looked, to people unfamiliar with what she'd been through, simply like aloofness. A boy stopped outside her kennel around midday. 9, maybe 10 years old, in a thick winter coat with a cartoon patch on the sleeve. He crouched down and said something through the bars in a voice too quiet for me to catch. Nova tilted her head, that slow, considering tilt, and then stood up and walked to him. His mother took hold of his shoulder. "Not this one, sweetheart. She looks poorly." "She's not poorly," the boy said without looking up. "She's just sad." The mother laughed softly, uncomfortable. "We're not taking on a project." They moved on. Nova sat back down and stared at the exact spot on the floor where the boy had been crouching. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders dropped, just barely. The smallest possible deflation, like air leaving something slowly. I stood with my fists in my pockets and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Later, I took her out to the backyard again. The afternoon light was thin and pale, the kind that winter gives grudgingly, low and long across the snow. I brought a tennis ball and set it on the ground between us. She sniffed it, pushed it slightly with one paw, and then simply sat beside me. "You don't have to do anything," I told her. "Not one single thing you're not ready for." She turned and laid her chin on my knee. I went very still. It was such a quiet gesture. No urgency in it, no desperation. Just a warm and steady weight against my leg, full of something I hadn't expected. It split something open in me, some sealed-off corner I had stopped visiting. I thought of Scout, my old shepherd, who used to do exactly this. That particular pressure of a forehead against a leg that meant I'm here, and I trust you, and that's enough. Nova stayed there for several minutes without moving. When I looked up, Claire was standing in the doorway watching us with her arms folded and her eyes too bright. She mouthed 2 words at me across the yard. "She picked you." I looked back down at the puppy with her chin on my knee and felt the complicated weight of that. Keeping her was not part of the plan. It never is. There are rules in place for good reason, and I had known from the first morning, from the bench, from the snow, that Nova needed more than one person in an apartment could give her. She needed a home. She needed a whole world that was hers. But sitting on a frozen bench in the pale winter afternoon with this dog leaning her whole quiet trust against my leg, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking that sometimes broken things don't need fixing. Sometimes they just need someone willing to sit with them in the cold. It happened just after lights out. I was locking the last door in the kennel wing when I heard it. A quick, light skitter of claws on tile, and then the distinct low groan of the back fire door swinging outward on its hinges. My chest locked. I moved fast, through the corridor, flashlight sweeping, keys rattling in my hand. The door hadn't latched properly. Someone had missed it on the evening check. The gap was narrow, barely a foot, but it had been enough. She was gone. I already knew where she was going. I grabbed my keys and pulled out of the car park before I'd finished thinking it through. The tires cutting through a thin skin of fresh snow, the heater still cold. Less than a mile between the shelter and the pier. In a car, barely 2 minutes. In the dark and the cold, with a bad leg, through snowdrifts and unfamiliar streets. I drove faster. The waterfront was empty. Street lamps cast their orange light in long pools across the ice-edged pavement. I pulled up near the back of the pier and my headlights caught her immediately. There she was, sitting on the same bench, in the same spot, in the snow, her red leash dragging behind her in the slush, the loop of it still around her collar from her evening walk. The pink suitcase was back at the shelter, had been since day one, but I could have sworn I almost saw it there beside her, a ghost of the first morning. She didn't look at me as I approached. She was facing down the length of the alley, stiff-backed and still, like a sentry who had not been relieved of their post. I sat down beside her. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The harbor water moved in the dark somewhere below us, steady and indifferent. The cold pressed in from every direction. "You really thought they'd come back, didn't you?" I said finally. Not a question. She blinked. "You didn't run away from us. You ran back to them." My throat tightened. I stared out at the black water and tried to find the right words, knowing there weren't any. "They don't deserve you, Nova," I said quietly, my voice doing something I hadn't given it permission to do. "But I do." And that was when she leaned into me. Not hesitantly, not slowly. She pressed her shoulder firmly against my leg and stayed there, solid and warm and deliberate. It wasn't memory. It wasn't habit. It was a decision. I looped the leash around my wrist and got to my feet. "Come on, then. Let's go home." She came, limping, slow, the bad leg dragging slightly in the snow. But she came without looking back. Back at the shelter, I laid a blanket on the floor beside her kennel and stretched out on it, one hand resting near her paw. She didn't go to the back corner. She curled up against my side, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, she made a sound. A low, soft sigh, long and slow and utterly without fear. She had gone back to the place where she'd been abandoned. And then she had chosen to come back to me. That was the night everything changed. She was standing at the kennel door when I arrived the next morning. Not curled up, not tucked in the corner, not watching the window. Standing wobbly, sure, but her head high, ears forward, eyes on me the moment I came through the door. "Look at you," I whispered, clipping on her leash. We went outside like we did every morning now, but something was different. She took the lead from the first step, nose to the ground, ears swiveling, eyes bright and scanning the cold morning air. She wasn't searching anymore. She was discovering. There's a difference, and it's enormous. She sniffed everything. Frozen grass, a patch of gravel, the base of the fence post, a dead leaf pressed flat by overnight frost. The winter wind ruffled her ears, and she pushed into it instead of turning away. She looked alive. At the far corner of the yard, she stopped and turned to look at me. Her tail swayed once, twice, and then she barked. Sharp, clear, confident. One single bark that rang out across the empty yard like a bell. Claire came running from the back door. Was that Nova? I was smiling before I'd realized it. That was Nova. Claire stood with both hands over her mouth for a moment, composing herself. You'd think, after long enough in rescue, you'd become immune to moments like that. You don't. You never do. From that day, she began to reclaim herself piece by piece. She chose a favorite toy, a frayed rope with a green knot at one end, and guarded it with quiet seriousness. She began sleeping in full sunlight near the yard fence, belly exposed, legs loose. She nudged other dogs through the kennel bars, not playfully yet, but curiously present, engaged. The vet adjusted her leg brace and confirmed what we'd begun to quietly hope. "She's healing better than expected," he said, turning her leg carefully in his hands. "No permanent damage that I can see. This dog has genuine resilience." At night, she stopped sleeping at the back of the kennel entirely. She slept facing the door now, facing the corridor, facing wherever I was. On evenings when I worked late and the building went quiet, she wouldn't settle until I passed her door. I tested it one evening, stood just out of her sight line and waited. For several minutes she sat with her ears rotating, her eyes fixed on the corridor, completely still. The moment I stepped into view, she lay down like something had been resolved. "She's imprinted on you," Claire said one evening, watching us from the office doorway. "You're her fixed point." I wanted to say it out loud. I want to keep her. Instead, I stood at Nova's kennel door in the half-dark and said nothing, because wanting something and doing right by someone are not always the same thing. Nova needed more than a fixed point. She needed a whole life, room to run, people to fill every corner of her world. I knew this. I believed it. It didn't make the wanting any quieter. They came in just before noon on a Tuesday, unhurried and a little uncertain, the way people sometimes are when they want something but aren't quite sure they're allowed to have it. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-30s, in a dark wool coat and boots still damp from the snow outside. She was smaller, in a burgundy jumper under an open jacket, with dark eyes and a smile that appeared and then retreated again, like someone practicing something they'd almost given up on. At the desk, she told Claire, "We're not looking for a specific dog. We want to see who's here, who might need us." Claire glanced at me across the room. I clipped Nova's leash and crouched down in front of her. "Come on. There's someone you should meet." She stood immediately, still limping but carrying herself with that quiet purpose she'd found over the past week. As we entered the visitation room and she saw the couple for the first time, she stopped. Not in fear, nothing like fear. She simply stood and looked at them, reading the room in that unhurried way of hers. I stepped back and let the space breathe. The woman lowered herself to her knees on the floor. "Hello, you," she said softly. Nova didn't rush her. She never rushed anything. She crossed the room slowly, came to a stop in front of the woman, and then sat. And then, after a moment, she leaned in, barely, just enough, and pressed her nose against the woman's open hand. The tears came immediately. The woman didn't wipe them away. The man crouched beside his partner, voice low. "She reminds me of us," he said. "Quiet, careful, still here." He held out his hand without moving toward her. Nova considered it. Then she stepped forward and rested her chin on his knee. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them in the pale winter light coming through the window. Afterwards, in the staff office with the door closed and the heating ticking quietly, they told me their story. 7 years of trying to have children. 7 years of hope stretched thin and then snapped, treatment after treatment, loss after loss, until their doctor sat them down last month and said, "Gently, carefully, you need to let go and make space for something else to come." "So we came here," Nora said. "We didn't know what we were looking for, and then we saw her photo on your website, and we both just stopped." "She looked like she was waiting for something," Owen added. "She was," I said, "but not for who she'd been waiting for before. I think she was waiting for you." I told them everything. The bench in the snow, the note, the suitcase, the silence, the exhale, the bark, the night she went back. They listened without interrupting, and when I finished, they both sat quietly for a moment, eyes wet. They asked about her leg, her diet, what frightened her, what helped her settle. They didn't ask about commands or training history or whether she could perform. They asked what made her feel safe. They asked what made her tail move. Before they left, Nora knelt beside Nova one final time and placed her hand gently on the top of her head. "If you come home with us," she said, "we won't try to fix you. We'll just love you. That's everything we've got. But it's yours if you want it." Nova looked at me, a long, steady look, the kind that says something. Then she looked back at Nora, and her tail swayed. Twice, she had made her choice. Now I had to learn how to honor it. The first night without her was harder than I'd prepared for. I know the shape of this work. Rescue, stabilize, heal, rehome. I've done it more times than I can count. I believe in it completely. It is the whole point. But knowing that doesn't stop the hollow feeling of walking down a kennel row and reaching the door where a particular nameplate used to be. Nova's blanket was folded. Her rope toy was in a box labeled with her name. The kennel was clean and quiet and completely empty in the way that only a recently vacated space can be. Owen and Nora had come that morning with a soft new harness and a blanket that smelled of their home. Nova had stood still and patient as they buckled it on. And when Owen opened the back door of their car, she climbed in without hesitation. She looked back once before the door closed. Not fearfully, not sadly, with a directness that felt like acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what you did. I'm all right now." I held my jaw tight and nodded. "She's going to be okay," Nora said quietly, reading my face. "I know," I said. Knowing and feeling are different languages. That evening I moved around my flat without purpose. Cooked something I barely tasted, left the television on for the noise of it. Around 10 o'clock I found myself in the hallway with the pink suitcase in my hands, sitting down on the floor with it in my lap without quite deciding to. I unzipped it, the glitter shirt, still folded, the brush, the empty space where the juice box had been. I sat there for a long time, turning the brush over in my hands, thinking about what it means to be left behind, what it costs, what it takes to come back from that kind of silence. She wasn't just a dog. She was a lesson, a scar, a testament to what happens when someone gives up on a living thing and what becomes possible when someone else refuses to. The next morning Claire met me at the door with her phone already out. "Look at this before you do anything else." It was a short video. Nova, stretched out on a sofa between Owen and Nora, her head in Nora's lap, her back legs twitching softly in whatever she was dreaming. A blanket draped over her, a fire burning low in the hearth behind them. The caption read, "She hasn't left our side since we got home. She's safe. Thank you." I watched it twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went to work. At Kennel 12, Nova's old kennel. I stopped, then stepped inside. The new arrival watched me from the back corner. A small mixed breed, 6 weeks old, reed thin, eyes darting with the erratic terror of something that has never once been safe. I sat down on the floor and said nothing. And I waited, because Nova had shown me that the first thing a frightened creature needs isn't guidance or correction or coaxing. It's someone willing to sit still inside the silence until they're ready to come out of it. 3 days later, the shelter doors opened and she walked through them. My heart did something involuntary when I saw her. Nova, moving through the entrance with her tail swaying, her coat fuller and brighter than I'd ever seen it. Her posture easy and assured in a way that made her look like an entirely different dog and entirely herself at once. Owen smiled. She wanted to come back. Nora laughed softly. So did we. We thought you might have something of hers. I led them to the office. I kept the suitcase, I said. Couldn't throw it out. It had sat in the cabinet behind my desk since the night I'd last opened it. When I set it on the floor, Nova was on it immediately. Sniffing every inch of it, her ears flicking back and forward, nose working at the corners and the zipper. Owen crouched beside her. Do you want it, girl? Nora looked at me. We don't want to erase any of it. We just want her to know she doesn't have to carry it by herself. I reached inside and lifted out the folded glitter shirt. This was in it when I found her. I kept it folded just how it was. I thought maybe it matters to her. Maybe it's a memory she should be allowed to keep. Nova turned and rested her head against my knee. Not needy, just quiet and warm and present. Nora's eyes were bright. Can we put it somewhere she can see it? Of course. They placed it on a shelf in their living room, they told me later. By the window where the winter morning sun falls across it. Not a memorial. Not a wound kept open. Just an acknowledgement that something happened and she survived it and she is loved anyway because of it and not despite it. When they left, Nova paused at the door and looked back at me one final time. Not at the building. At me. Then she stepped outside into the cold white afternoon and didn't look back again. The next morning there was a photograph in my inbox. Nova, curled by a frost-edged window with her head on a stuffed bear, half asleep in a pool of pale winter light. Behind her, on the shelf, the pink suitcase. The message underneath read, "She knows she's safe now, and so do we." I read it standing in my kitchen in the cold, still in my coat, and I didn't feel the hollow thing I'd been bracing for. I felt proud, because Nova wasn't just rescued. She wasn't just rehomed. She was known. Fully, honestly, in all her silence and her damage and her faithfulness, and chosen anyway. She had become someone's beginning. Updates came every few days. Nova asleep in a patch of winter sun on the kitchen floor. Nova on a slow walk along the harbor, her brace off for short stretches, nose lifted to the sea wind. Nova on the bed at night, always with one paw touching Owen and one touching Nora, as though even in sleep she needed to know the edges of the world she'd chosen. But one message stayed with me longer than the others. It was just a photograph. Nova sitting at the top of their staircase, ears forward, gaze trained on the front door. The caption read, "She still waits, not because she's afraid, out of hope for us to come home." I looked at that image for a long time, not with sadness, with something closer to understanding. Nova had sat by that bench in the snow and waited because waiting was the only faithful thing left. But faithfulness doesn't disappear just because it's been failed. It redirects. It finds new people to pour itself into. She had found hers. One afternoon in late winter, Nora called ahead and then arrived with a tin of biscuits for the staff and something else under her arm. A framed photograph. Nova, mid-leap across a snowy field, ears streaming back, tongue out, all four paws off the ground, caught at the exact moment when gravity had finally, completely, let her go. Nora set it on the front desk without ceremony. For the shelter. For the next one. We stood and looked at it together for a moment. Movement. Life restored. She turned to me. "You gave her back to herself." I shook my head. She just needed somewhere quiet enough to remember who she was. That night, I did my final walk through the kennel row. At the door of Kennel 12, I stopped. The new arrival inside, a small beagle mix we'd started calling Pepper, launched himself at the door the moment he saw me. Tail going, small body barely containing itself. I stepped inside and sat down. He dropped his toy at my feet and looked at me with the open, uncomplicated hope of something that hasn't yet been let down enough times to stop hoping. I picked up the toy and held it out. And just like that, a new story began with silence, and someone willing to stay inside it. Some dogs aren't broken. They're just waiting for the right person to sit with them in the quiet long enough to matter. Nova didn't need to be fixed. She needed to be believed in, steadily, patiently, through the silence and the cold and the long nights in between. Her journey from a frozen bench to a warm home proves what becomes possible when someone refuses to walk away. Because somewhere tonight, there's another dog sitting in the cold beside a story no one has stopped to read yet. Not asking for a miracle, just asking for someone who won't leave. Be that person. Be their voice. Be their warmth.